Well, good morning. My name is Brad Brisco. Let me give you a little bit of background. I've actually been a church planting catalyst for the North American Mission Board for about 20 years. And then about 3 years ago, though, I actually took a new role, more of a national role at the North American Mission Board that's called Director of Bivocational Church Planting. So it's funny, a lot of times people will ask, well, what does that mean? And I'll say, well, normally I'll say it's really, for me, it's about two kind of big rocks. It's about rethinking vocation, and it's about rethinking church planting. So when I say rethinking vocation, what I mean by that is I'm convinced that we need to help not just church planters, but we need to help all the people of God to understand, regardless of what God's called them to do in the marketplace, they're in full-time ministry. So in other words, I'm convinced that we need to kind of diminish or blow up this sacred-secular divide, that some callings are sacred and other callings are secular. I would argue if God reigns over all things, and he does, then all things are sacred. So we need to help people see, regardless of what God's called them to do in the marketplace, how does that contribute to and participate in the mission of God? So that's part of this role, is rethinking our callings or our vocations. But the second part is rethinking church planting. And what I mean by that is I'm convinced in an increasing missionary context, we need to start more with discipleship and mission and lead to church rather than start with church and try to get to discipleship and mission. So I'll say to church planters all the time, especially if they're bivocational church planters, that I think in a missionary context, we need to, so there's a whole years and activities and work towards a Sunday gathering. Don't start with a Sunday gathering. So there's a whole lot kind of tied up in all that, and that's what we're going to talk about here for the next few minutes. So when I moved into this new role, I knew there were a few kind of key things that I wanted to work on for the first couple of years. And what really influenced that were lots and lots of conversations that I had with bivocational church planters and bivocational pastors. And one of the things I discovered in those conversations is I think there's a biased narrative that many people have about bivocational ministry. So what I mean by that biased narrative is I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of bivocational pastors and church planters that they hear kind of these whispers that their ministry isn't legitimate or their ministry isn't as important as a fully funded church planter. And I just think that's absolutely wrong, that they actually need to become, in many ways, our heroes. They need to become our champions. So they hear these, questions from people about when are you going to get a full-time church? Or when are you going to be at a church that's large enough to pay a full-time salary? Well, that's what I mean by a biased narrative. And I was convinced the very first thing I needed to do when I took this new role a couple years ago is I needed to be involved in trying to change that biased narrative. So this morning, what I'd like to do is there's kind of 4 big points I want us to talk about, but the first one I want to talk about is how do we change the narrative. So I'm convinced there's multiple ways to do it, but I like to frame the way we need to change that biased narrative in 3 ways. So the first one, as I say, the first thing we have to do is we have to champion the benefits of bivocational ministry. And I think there are lots and lots of benefits. I'll usually frame those benefits in 3 ways. The first one, I'll just call it missional engagement. What I mean by this, and all of you already know this, but a bivocational pastor or a bivocational church planter has access to a mission field that a fully funded person simply doesn't have, right? I mean, when they're engaged in the marketplace, the way I like to say it a lot of times is I'll say, because more and more people are less and less interested in the programs and activities of the church, as missionary-minded people, we have to figure out where are those places that we can connect with people and do life with lost people. Well, I'm convinced one of the best places to do that is in the marketplace. So one of the ways to change the narrative is we must talk about the benefits, and the missionary or missional engagement benefit is enormous. Now another little part of this, I think, and you'll notice on the slide there, it says street cred. I'm convinced as a bivocational church planter, you have great street cred both inside the church and outside the church. So what I mean by that is inside the church, you have street cred with the people in your congregation because they know you have a job like they do in the marketplace. And they know that you understand. So I think even more importantly, grind is Monday through Friday because you have a job like they do. But then also, and I think even more important than that, there's great street cred for you with people outside the church. In other words, when someone asks you what you do, and again, I think this is really important in an increasing missionary context, if you can lead with your calling in the marketplace, I've just noticed it makes all the difference in the world. So you actually have street cred. Instead of saying I'm a pastor, to lead with. In some cases, that might be very appropriate, but there's a lot of times people are very skeptical or maybe even hostile towards that. If you can lead with, well, I'm a web designer, or I'm a plumber, or I'm a doctor, whatever that might be, it just opens up other opportunities. So all of that is just a slice of one of the benefits of what I would call missional engagement. A second benefit is what I call financial stability. And again, I think there's great benefits here on three levels. Number one, there's great financial stability for the church planter, because if the primary support is coming from the marketplace, I've just discovered there's less financial strain on the church planter's family. And I know, and many of you have probably planted churches before, but I remember there was one point, my wife, when we were planting a church, she joked that I had 6 different jobs. Because the reality is, as a church planter, a lot of times you have to have multiple side hustles just to make ends meet. But if you have one primary calling in the marketplace, and especially if that calling provides benefits like vacation or insurance is a huge thing, right? Financially, is not just a financial strain on the church planting family. But a second benefit financially is not just on the church planter's family, but on the church plant itself. I mean, it makes sense that if the primary support for the planter is coming from the marketplace, there's obviously going to be more resources available for mission and ministry. So I think it's better for the church plant. And then third, I would say for the church planting entity. So if that's a local association, if it's a state convention, if it's a North American Mission Board, we know we do not have enough money to plant all the churches we need to plant with fully funded planters. The only possible way we're going to see a movement of in church planting is to plant churches with bivocational church planters. We don't have enough money. We have certain cities around the country. It's just too expensive to send a fully funded church planter into those places. We have some population groups that's just never going to be sustainable. So we have to plant churches with bivocational church planters. So we've got to talk about the benefits. We got to talk about the missionary benefits. We talk about the financial benefits. And then the third one, I just call shared leadership. And what I mean by this is I am absolutely convinced with any church plant, we need to be planting churches with teams. But it's absolutely crucial if you're a bivocational, or here in a minute we're going to talk about co-vocational. If you're a bivo or co-vo church planter, it's essential that you plant with a team. You know, if you're working 34 church plant, so you have in the marketplace, there's no possible way you can do everything that needs to be done as the church plant. So you have to do it with the team. And I actually think it's a huge benefit, because if you are bivo or co-vo in the marketplace, then people that are a part of your team, they recognize right off, if you're not fully funded, they need to come alongside, and there needs to be a kind of a shared mutual, sometimes I'll call it a round table leadership. All right, does that make sense? So part of kind of this new role moving in to trying to change the narrative around bivocational church planting, we need to champion all these benefits. So that's one big rock. The second big rock, though, to change the narrative is not only to champion or highlight the benefits, but I think we actually need to champion the bivo planters themselves. So I would argue if you're in any position, if you are a bivo planter, you need to tell your story. If you know bivo planters, you need to tell their stories. If you're in a denominational role, we need to find opportunities to capture the stories of bivocational church planters, and we need to tell their stories. We need to tell their stories to be an encouragement to them. So we say to them, no, this is not only legitimate, it's absolutely necessary. And again, they need to be our champions. But maybe even, or just as important as that, we need to tell their stories to crack open the imagination of other people. So other people, when they see that there's a high school science teacher who's planting a church, it cracks open their, I didn't know I could be a bus driver. I didn't even know that was an option. I mean, I didn't know I could be a school teacher and plant a church. I didn't know I could be a bus driver and plant a church. So we need to tell their stories to be an encouragement to them, but we need to tell their story to kind of crack open the imagination of other people. So highlight the benefits, highlight the planters themselves. And then the third part of changing the narrative is what I call we need to change the language. So here's why I'm convinced we need to change the language. I actually think the word bivocational sometimes gets in the way of what we actually want to accomplish. And here's how I describe that. Have you ever heard the word bifurcate? To bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, unfortunately, I think sometimes when we use the language of bivocational pastoring or bivocational church planting, we do just that. We compartmentalize what we do. So we have some bivocational pastors that think, or here's the way they think, they say, I do my work over here so I can do ministry over here. we bifurcate or compartmentalize those things. Well, I want to encourage them to say, no, don't compartmentalize. Let's figure out a way to align those two together. So you see that one isn't sacred and one's secular, or one's legitimate and one isn't, but they're both legitimate, and we need to figure out how can we better kind of wed those two things together. So part of doing that, this isn't the end-all answer, but part of that is at the North American Mission Board, I've started using language, and I still use both bivocational, but this other word, co-vocation. So what I mean by co-vocation, the difference is that little prefix co, comes from the Latin prefix com, C-O-M. Well, you probably recognize that com comes from the word common, or to have in common. So that prefix co means to have in common, or it actually means equality. So think about words like co-pilot, or co-author, or co-laborer. It's about bringing two things together. So here's a little nuance. I still use bivo and covo because I think they're both necessary and legitimate, but here's a little nuance of the way I try to differentiate between those two words. So here's the way I would define bivo, or bivocational, as it relates to church planting. I say a bivocational church planter is one who works a second job to supplement the salary the church provides. Okay, so this is historically, this is the Apostle Paul, it's the tent maker, right? Their hope is that the church will eventually be in a position to provide the financial support for the planter to leave their bivocational job to focus full-time on the church plant. So my point here is that most bivocational pastors or bivocational church planters, if the church got, their dream or aspiration as a church planter is the church eventually gets to a position to where it can fund them full time, and they'll leave their parts of bivocational place. Again, absolutely nothing wrong with that, right? When we have lots of bivocational planters that think that way, and that's great. But I think we need to add another layer to that, and that's what I mean, and that's what I want to try to do with the language of covo. So here's the nuance for me. A co-vocational church planter is one whose primary vocation is in the marketplace and at the same time is called to start a church. A co-vo planter is one who has a clear calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. They know God has called them to be a teacher, a mechanic, a graphic designer, or a doctor, and they desire to weave that calling into the plan to plant a church. So over the last 6 months probably, I've had, I bet, 100 conversations with co-vocational planters. So these are people that know God has called and wired them to something in the marketplace that they love to do, and they're never going to leave it. But at the same time, they feel this tug on their heart. They're just convinced that God's calling them to start something. So do you see the difference? And they're both absolutely necessary. They're both legitimate. One's not more important than the other. But I think with the co-vocational language, my hope is that when we begin to change the narrative and we begin to champion bivo planters and we begin to champion the benefits, we'll have people that never thought this was an option, kind of like coming out of the woodwork, sitting in ministry. God's calling them to do something, but they didn't think they could do anything in ministry, quote unquote ministry, when they had a full-time calling in the marketplace. So I'll tell you, just this, in the last 7 days, talked to a fireman, planted a church 8 years ago in San Diego. It is so much fun to hear him talk about being a fireman. It makes me want to be a fireman. But he's done this for 8 years, and he planted this church. He's never taken a penny from the church. All of his staff is bivo because he set the example. I was supposed to have a call 2 nights ago with an anesthesiologist in the Bay Area, but he texted me and said, I'm going to have to reschedule because I was just called into an emergency surgery. So, and he's at a church that's probably 5 or 6 years old, and he's a doctor, and he's planted a church, has a full team of bivocational pastors. It just runs the gamut. Talked to a guy a couple days ago, who's a bus driver. I wrote a book about 6 months ago. It's a free download called Vocational Church Planting. He read that book and he got my contact information. I had about a 30-minute call with him just a couple of days ago. He was so encouraged. He said, I started reading this book and I thought, this is me. He said, this is me. And he was telling me about how many opportunities he has driving this bus that he said I would never have. And he said, these people aren't coming to my church. Just not out of the blue. Now, some of them are coming because of the relationship that he's built driving the bus, right? So I think this opens up an opportunity for a group of people that we never considered before, right? So both very legitimate, both very necessary, but I'm hoping with the language of COVO, changing the language will actually help us to begin to change the narrative, all right? So just a couple other things. So we've already said, first big rock is we've got to change the narrative, and we do it by highlighting the benefits, highlighting the planters, and changing the language.